missions. We're probably all familiar with the message of supporting missions. In fact, we are a very missional church. But I want to candidly ask you to kind of journey with my heart concerning what God has given us to do as His church. And by His church, I don't mean just community church, but the church as a whole. Though our service this morning can be just summarized as a fundraising campaign, I believe it's much more than that. I believe it's an opportunity that you can have to allow the Holy Spirit to change your life, your family, your relationships, and the way you see His kingdom that directly impacts your behavior for the months and years ahead of us. I don't want you to feel guilty or feel obligated this morning or give out of guilt or make commitments out of guilt, but I want you to give me an opportunity to fuel the compassion in your heart, because it's one of those elements. Compassion is one of the few elements or dynamics in the Christian faith that sets us apart from all other faiths. We're compassionate because God is compassionate. And many times that compassion puts our heart in a place of repeatedly experiencing the pain people experience, so we don't forget or don't grow calloused to the struggle that many of our friends, family, nations around the world face. How many of y'all have ever had a callus form on your hands? I remember years ago, you can probably think, years ago when I was young and wild and crazy, decided to start playing the guitar. And playing guitar, like many other instruments, requires a certain level of practice and practice and practice. And of course, rubbing your fingertips on metal guitar strings will produce a callus, right? And the goal of guitar players, that first 6 months of their starting, practicing, and learning, is to develop calluses on their fingertips so you can easily move your fingers across the strings without pain, because it is painful to push that hard on metal strings for long periods of time. And over time, what will happen is good guitar players, those calluses will develop, and you won't even be able to notice that there's calluses, right? But they're hard and they're tough. And the sensitivity on the fingertips, as you would imagine, goes away. Well, I used to play guitar a lot. Now I barely play. And so over time, what happened is those calluses got removed, either cut off, picked off, bit off, whatever. They got removed. And the sensitivity is back. So now if I pick up a guitar to have some fun with my son or whomever and play a little bit, after about 20 minutes of playing, I'm done. Right? I'm done. Because it's too sensitive. And I think sometimes we go through that process in our heart. We see images, pictures, videos, hear stories. And after a while, from the guy on the street corner who's asking for food, the person that's walking around the Walmart parking lot hoping for some spare change, after numerous encounters like that, your heart can get calloused to the real need people have, the real brokenness. In fact, we can even just start thinking things like, well, they just need to get a job. They're just being lazy. And granted, that may be the case sometimes. But a lot of times, we don't even have a clue of the hell they're coming out of or the hell that they're in. And we can get calloused to people. And the dangerous thing about being calloused is not only you just lose a sensitivity to what you want to lose sensitivity to, but you lose sensitivity to many things you should not lose sensitivity to. And that callous, when it comes into our thinking, can lead us to a place where we're not even sensitive to the compassion that God has for broken people. And that's a dangerous place. When the poor come by us, the needy, the drug addict, the homeless, the impoverished, and we don't respond with compassion, that's a red flag. There's a callous. And listen, I'm not saying empty your wallet out to everybody that asks, but I'm saying there's a way to build your budget to respond to the need so you don't ever grow calloused. My wife and I, we give to our missions program every week. It goes right out of my paycheck into the missions fund. And I see those newsletters, and I don't grow calloused because I'm constantly putting it in front of my face. It's not that I'm going to do it when the Lord tells me, then, Stephen, I'm going to be compassionate. You don't know when the Lord is telling you because the callous has come into a fullness in your life. You have to work at being compassionate to remove the calluses, is what I'm saying. I put together a story to share with you, or typed up, I should say, a story, and I want to read it to you. And the reason I wrote it down is because I know I'm going to have difficulty talking about it. Yes, we're going to cry this morning. I'm just sorry. Get the tissue. They're all at the ends of the aisles. Reach over, grab one. But my goal in telling you this story is not just so you'll empathize with the need, but you will allow the Holy Spirit, if you will, this morning, to just rip off some calluses in our heart. And I'm not saying that in a condemning way. I'm just saying naturally we get calloused to people's suffering because we live in such a great level of success, comfort. We can get comfortable so well that we lose our sensitivity. But we in the kingdom, the followers of Jesus, have to work against that callousness, as I'm saying this morning. And so this morning, as I read this story to you, I'm going to try to make it through, but there's no guarantees. And then probably later on this week, I'll post it, and you can go back and read it again. It happened, this story, it happened this past June. My son, Shiloh, and I, and our good friend JC, wherever he's at, we had the invitation to go to the Dominican Republic. I didn't know what we were getting into. I still, to this day, don't know how they found us. They called us and asked us to come, and I traced out all the possibilities, and we don't have no idea how they called us or got our information. But they called, and they said, why don't you come and just see the work that's happening down here at the Dominican? Well, like you, when I hear the word Dominican Republic, think Caribbean vacation. Yay! Right? It's in the Caribbean. I have friends from the Dominican. It's a great thing, you know. Not realizing what I was walking into. Now, I've been on mission trips. I've been around the world some 40, 45 times. I've seen some crazy places, been in crazy places. So it's not like I'm going in just completely naive to what may happen there. But I want to read you one day of our trip that I journaled, and I want to share my thoughts with you on this trip as you'll listen. You with me? Midway through my recent trip in the Dominican, my son and I visited, along with JC, a local garbage dump. As we pulled down the road about a quarter mile before the entrance, waves of stench slammed our senses with a rude awakening. Flies swarmed in and out of the bus as we drove up to the trash pile hill. As we stepped out of the bus, I scanned the scene of endless refuse. Small swarms of adults and kids worked earnestly in searching through the rubbish. They had no gloves, no decent shoes. Children worked as they were covered in grime and clothed in rags. They glanced at us knowing why we were there, and they turned their gaze back to the heaps of trash. In the distance, I could see a majestic white cruise ship docked about half a mile from the shore. Our friend Mike, who you'll see tonight, said that the dump day of the cruise ship draws a crowd of men, women, and children who compete for the trash. They hope to find edible food and usable items. They take the half-eaten meat and other items back to their little shacks and, quote, cook the death out of it so they can eat. After a few minutes of resisting the impulse to swat flies and not breathe deeply, my senses grew accustomed to the stench. As children gathered around us, I held back tears as I filled the first styrofoam cup with a cup of soup, hot soup. This is not right, I thought to myself, as the first child's scarred fingers clasped the cup. I pushed through the deeper feeling of rage and scooped another cup. Dios te ama, I said to each recipient. They didn't smile. They clasped their cup and slowly stumbled I lost the rest of my story. Did I leave it down there? The suspense. Thank you, babe. They clasped their cup and slowly stumbled back to the shaded area to eat one more meal. The one meal they would get that day, possibly for several days. After the soup was served, Mike handed me one of the bags of peanut butter sandwiches we had made that morning. As I took out the small crushed sandwich and gave it to an elderly woman, she took it, made her way a couple of steps away from me, and then came back for another sandwich. She hid the first sandwich behind her, hoping for a second. I placed another one in her hand and was determined to give her as many as I could and as she could hold. Each kid, mom, and dad did the same. They knew this would be the only meal they would eat until the Cups mission team would return. Because of the Cups ministry, the work of the kingdom keeps going out in this region. While standing in the middle of the dump, Mike took a minute to unfold to us a biblical phrase that I had often read, Matthew 5:29-30 and Mark 9:41-46. In these passages, Jesus speaks of Gehenna. The word is often translated as hell, but also is a reference to an actual garbage dump in Jesus' day. As we stood there on the piles of trash below our feet, Mike asked us to look around for pockets of smoke that would rise out of the ground. The smoke indicated a decomposing trash underground that was forcing methane gas to surface. Occasionally, Mike explained, the oxygenated wind blows into the pockets of simmering gases and causes an explosion that engulfs the dump in flames. The residents run for cover as the trash piles burn, and then they return to the smoldering heaps. Added to this perpetual burning are worms of decay, which make the dump a clear image of Gehenna, the place Jesus referenced in his depiction of hell. Standing there on the refuse pile of hell that many Haitian families experienced, I felt powerless. The darkness we witnessed in the broad, scorching daylight drained my soul. As the evening made way for darker hours, our team drove down to the red light district of the Dominican region. We learned how the blatant trafficking of women and children to American and European consumers had grown to be an accepted business. The abusive racism against Haitians cursed many of these women into the prisons of prostitution. We heard stories of mothers who had raised their daughters on the Dominican dream. This nightmare is sold to little girls who know nothing other than hand-to-mouth poverty. They are told if they will give their bodies to a European or American man for one night, there's a chance that one of these men will love and care for them and possibly come back for them and rescue them from the hell of prostitution. They may get lucky and be taken out to some U.S. or other country to be a prostitute turned bride. Night after night, little girls and teens sell their souls to this deception, only to have their bodies broken by perversion, the perversion of men who offer nothing more than a meager handful of cash. These two scenes during our mission trip stirred my soul to anguish. But beyond the sheer horror of these scenes emerges a penetrating question. What can we do? And where is the church? Mike would later tell me the churches in this region shun the prostitutes for fear of their sin. Yet there we were in the red light district, moving as large groups of believers from one corner to the next, our team offering mothers and daughters a small care package of supplies and prayers of hope. Our team of ladies held every hand that reached out to them and prayed for hope and healing. Later, I would learn how this persistent practice of street ministry weekly would extend opportunities to every woman who wanted to leave this bondage. This window day of events keeps going, day after day, week after week, month after month, long after I returned here to the United States. This morning, there's a team in Puerto Plata, Dominican Republic, preparing for this week to do exactly this on Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday, whatever day they have scheduled. And as I think about these moments, these scenes in my mind, I was there with me and JC, and my son were there. And I would love to tell you that there were no calluses, but I knew they were there. Calluses that told me there's an ocean that separates me from this. Calluses that tell me, well, God will just provide. Later, the next day after this event, went with Mike to one of the orphanage community centers, is what they call them, that they have. And me and Mike, as I was still shaken from the events of the day before, he began to share with me how he gave up his incredible career in the United States as a nationally known comedian. Him, his wife, and his 2 daughters moved to the Dominican to step in as the leadership of this ministry and expand the work of God's kingdom for 12 years. Mike and his family have done more in 12 years than I've seen most missionaries able to do in a couple of lifetimes. As we were working with Mike and his team in these various camps, 70-something children were volunteers whom they had rescued out of the industry. 70. And they had trained them to read, write, work a job, make pizzas, sew backpacks, various skills that would keep them from having to get to the bottom barrel occupation of prostitution. Mike would tell me later, I just need another $40,000 to build the next center, the next project. I just need an X amount of dollars to do this, to do that. And I'm not saying that just to pull on the heartstrings of your purse strings, if you will, but I'm here to tell you the need is great. The need is great. I came back home and I tried to write down everything I experienced a few days after we returned. I couldn't do it. The images, the smell, the harshness. And then Mike, of course, when I was there, gave me a copy of his book entitled Kidnapped. Tells a story of some of the young ladies, families they've rescued. It's heartrending. And listen, I know all of us love to hear a great story of redemption. But not every story has a happy ending. Not every story ends well. And I'm sure tonight Mike's going to share some of those stories. But there's a part that we play in every one of these stories that are happening, whether in the Dominican or one of the other 48 missionaries that we support around the world. And our part is to join with the compassion God has for these regions. Our heart is to join with the compassion God has for these communities. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but out of an eternal sense of you have been given keys to establish his kingdom in every part of the world that you can reach. My eschatology, that big word means study of the end times, has been really jacked up the last few months as I've been reading a few books. When I was growing up, my parents introduced me and my brother and sisters to this movie series, A Thief in the Night, A Distant Thunder, and I forgot the third movie. But in the movie, the storyline went like this. You'll have to humor me if you know it. Jesus comes back, the rapture happens, and all these people are disappeared, and then the world starts going crazy, right? They introduced the mark of the beast, they put chips in people's hands, people that resist, they were somewhat associated with following Jesus, but they were left behind. And just the overwhelming sense of abandonment throughout the story. And of course, as this, 1960s, 1970s actors quality can go, there's beheading of Christians, there's persecution, they're hiding from the Antichrist and all the people and all the government people that are taking over. And, it was a horror movie is really what it was. And we probably should have been rated R, and we probably should not have watched it until we had some capacity to handle that level of stress. But after we watched that movie at a youth lock-in at our church, late night hours, I couldn't sleep for a few days. And then I remember we lived in a little house there in Nederland. One day I came home because we were, dropped off at home from school, wherever. And I walked in the front door, and nobody was home. The front door was unlocked, and me and my brother were the only two people there, which was very unusual. There was no food cooking in the kitchen. Everybody was gone. And so the first thing we thought of was, we've been left behind. And Joseph, my brother, raced through the house, yelling, "Mom and Dad, Mom and Dad." I looked around the living room and I thought, there's no point in yelling. We've been left behind. And my mind, of course, goes back to the movie of what did they do? Well, they packed all their stuff and they went and hid. And so I began to proceed to thinking, what do I need to pack to go hide in my little mind? And then I had an idea. To ensure that we had been left behind, I was like, I'll call people that I know are Christians. The only problem was I didn't know any of their numbers. And this was before cell phones, that memorized those numbers. And so my mind was furious, my heart was racing, my anxiety level rising, and I thought, you know what? This is how I know. I turned on the TV, and I knew if TBN was going, we were okay. Sure enough, Paul and Jan Crouch were on TBN, the rapture did not happen, and everything was okay. And within a few minutes, Mom came back. And that philosophy of end-time theology got imprinted at such a young age that I began to believe some elements of that were the reality I would eventually face in my life. Of course, this was back in 1980, 1990. 2000s. And much of that theology still persists, and I'm not here to talk eschatology, but a deep current in this idea is that the end of the world will look like this. Wickedness will triumph, the church will be gone, and God will judge the world. And though some elements of that is true, I think there's a deeper and more powerful truth that we miss in following that narrative. Because when Jesus speaks of the kingdom and the end of the age, he has a different scenario. And we find it in Matthew chapter 24, if you'll go there with me. And this is the story, and I want you to hang on with me. I know you probably think I've taken a left turn here, but I haven't. Jesus and his disciples are there at the temple grounds, the same area that today we call the Temple Mount. But there's a different temple there, Herod's temple. And they're there doing what we do when we have friends come over to our house. They wanted to show Jesus how awesome the place was. All the things that King Herod had done for the Jews and how they had made this temple incredible, And as they're showing him the temple, Jesus says to them as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples come to him and say, "Tell us, when will the end of the age be?" Actually, it says here, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Because Jesus, after the tour of the temple, told them this place is going to be destroyed, right? If somebody comes to your house and you show them your house, and at the end they say, "Yeah, this is all going down, buddy. It'll be destroyed in a couple of years." You'll be like, "I'm never inviting you over to my house again," right? It's essentially the same thing. Jesus tells them, this is all going to be destroyed. The thing that the Jewish culture patterned their life after was worshiping God in this one place, this temple. And then they say, okay, well, if it's going to be destroyed, Jesus, tell us when, right? They say to him, tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So there's 3 questions here. And Jesus answered and said to them, take heed or be cautious or pay attention that no one deceives you. For many will come. Now listen, what is he saying this for? Because there will be a lot of deception about the end times. He's not saying don't be deceived because everybody's going to figure it out. He's saying don't be deceived because a lot of people won't figure it out. Don't be deceived, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled. I think in the New Amplified, NIV, whatever Message translation, they should say, and don't watch these movies. Just my thought. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in various places. And these are the beginning of sorrows. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. And then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. Now watch this. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Let me read that statement back to you. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. I've sat across the table with some profound popular theologians and presented this question: what does this mean? And for the most part, the fear dynamic of end-time prophecy has really been an absurd distraction for the church. A costly, absurd distraction. It comes across in language like, listen, Jesus is coming, you better get ready. Jesus is coming, get your house in order. And we don't realize the calluses on our heart that doesn't allow us to go, Jesus is coming. We have to get the world ready. We have to take this gospel to the ends of the earth first. Get rid of your fear and put on your working shoes. Get rid of your apocalyptic propaganda and go put on a tool belt. Learn how to present the gospel in a living way to lost people and get busy. Keep going. What happens with fear, as any psychologist will tell you, is fear has this crippling ability to just stagnate your soul in suspense until eventually fear loses its grip. Christians, born again, believing, life received from Jesus Christians, can go years afraid of Jesus' return, not realizing their callous has kept them in a place of ineffectiveness for the kingdom. What am I saying to you this morning? I'm challenging you to think about, there's a possibility, don't yell at me when I say this, Jesus is not coming back until we do what he said. He's not coming back because your candidate didn't become president. He's not coming back because your party isn't in charge of the Senate and the House. He's not coming back because the inflation has gone up and you're struggling in your finances. He's not coming back because life has gotten difficult for you and you have fallen into the trap of believing as the world gets deeper and deeper in sin and harder and harder to follow Jesus in, that's the sign of his return. It's not. Jesus said it's the beginning. The sign of his return is that this gospel must be preached in all the world to all nations, and then the end will come. And he that endures to the end, they're the saved. What does that look like, Stephen? What does that even mean? Because now I got to go burn all my Left Behind books and trash all the movies. What does that even mean? As we were standing in the Dominican, there in the trash pile, there on the red light district, it's an experience that you can only get when you're there, to feel around you the darkness, the perversion, the wickedness. People, little Haitian kids, trapped sociologically, economically, bounded by the government into this hell. You could feel the darkness destroying their life. You could feel it. And if I could jump the language barrier, jump the cultural barrier, how in the world do we get them out? Because I promise you, if it was not for this little ministry called Cups Missions, they would not see the good news of the kingdom at all. They wouldn't know it. But I can tell you of thousands, some almost 2 billion people in the world today that have never seen what it looks like to follow Jesus and experience him. 2 billion. 2 billion. We cannot, with calloused hearts, think to ourselves, I hope Jesus comes back soon. 2 billion. The thing that impedes his return, might I propose, is that we have work to do. We have work to do. Not just in foreign nations, but also in downtown West Orange, in downtown Port Arthur, in downtown Beaumont, where kids are born, raised, live, and die without ever seeing the life evidence of how Jesus acts once. This gospel of this kingdom must be preached to them before the end will come. What do I mean by that? As we look at this passage in Matthew 24, when Jesus says this gospel must be preached, that word literally means to become known publicly and loudly as important news announced by a herald. An unmistakable evidence, that's what the kingdom looks like. That's what the kingdom looks like. And let me kind of take some confusion out of this thought. It's not just they have a Bible available. It's not just there's a church available. It's that they have been touched by someone, a follower of Jesus, who can show them who Jesus is. Someone has loved on them, and they have experienced Jesus. That's what preaching the gospel looks like. He says this gospel must be preached, and then he says as a witness, to emphasize the quality of exposure one must have to the gospel for this prophecy to be fulfilled. He says, a witness, which means a testimony or a verbal evidence of a witness by which something is affirmed to be true. This gospel must be preached in all the world as a witness to the degree that people see it. They say, that is the truth. That's the truth. This gospel of the kingdom must be preached in all the world as a witness to every nation. And that word there literally means every ethnos, people group. They have to see the church vibrantly alive in their community and say, that's the truth. And until that happens, in every corner of the world, the end is not coming. I know what you're thinking. We got a lot of work to do. A lot of work to do, because we sometimes can run into family members who cannot say, I have witnessed the gospel of the kingdom. We have work to do. I think when I see the scriptures through this clear lens of what Jesus says the end times will look like, there's a level of discouragement. It's like running a race and thinking you're near the end, only to realize this is just the first lap. And there's about 20 more coming. And your heart says, oh my goodness, I don't think I'll make it this time. And somehow in our theology, we have moved that finish line up so close to us to think he's coming. And some 2 billion, and I want to say the number actually is like 2.7. I'm sorry, my wife is telling me. 3.8 billion. My numbers are off a little bit. That's okay. 3.8 billion people have not seen the gospel of the kingdom. And I'll tell you, historically, a lot of times what missions organizations have said is, once we get a Bible in their language of these 3.8 billion people, then they have a witness of the gospel. The only problem with that thought is there was no Bible when Jesus made this statement. So the scriptures cannot mean something to us now that it did not mean to the hearers then. Did you hear me? We can't interpret that statement to mean, and listen, I want Bibles in every language, but you can print Bibles in every language, and that doesn't mean the gospel of the kingdom has been preached in all the world. It means you printed a Bible, a tool to bring the gospel to that people group. But just because you print the Bibles, granted, majority of that 3 billion people are illiterate. So giving them a Bible doesn't do much. They have to have a witness. And some of us will say, well, what if we have a missionary in every country? How many of you have ever been on a trip to a distant place? And like Russia or China or wherever. And this happens all the time when I go on a mission trip. I remember one year I went to China. Y'all know how many people are in China? Bajillions, billions, right? And I came back from China, and I was, at a church in the lobby or whatever. I remember where it was important ages at a church. And I was talking to some friends, and they were asking about the trip. And they said, I've got a friend in China. Do you know him? And I'm thinking, maybe I ran into him among the 3-4 billion people in China. Just because there's a church doesn't mean people are seeing the kingdom. It might be a big church with a big steeple, but that doesn't mean they're seeing the kingdom. I'm not saying that to diminish the value of planting churches. We want them planted. But Jesus didn't say, go plant churches. He said, this gospel of the kingdom must be preached as a witness to all nations. So we have to send people who can go into a community, raise up believers who have a community of followers of Jesus so that others can see that's the truth. Say, Stephen, that sounds like it's going to take some time. It's taken 2,000 years to get here. It might take us a little bit longer to get the other 3.8 billion. And why am I telling you that this morning? Just a discouragement? No. But to brace yourself for the work. Because here's the promise that we have, that the latter rain, or the final move of God, will be much, 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 much greater than the former moves of God. There are pockets now. Just as I was in the Dominican and could sense these pockets of communities crushed by demonic oppression, crushed by poverty, perversion. There are, right now in the world, pockets of communities where the power of God is so strong that governors, presidents, and kings have submitted their city, their country, their state, as we're following Jesus. There's communities right now, not just in remote islands somewhere, throughout nations of the world, where men of God, women of God have said, we are dedicating our city to Jesus. There's billboards in parts of Guatemala, in parts of Kenya, in parts of Cali, Colombia, in parts of South America, where Jesus has so overwhelmed a community that it is hard to go to hell if you live there. Because every car dealer and every mechanic, every grocery store has scriptures of Jesus saves on every billboard, and they are pockets of witnesses to the kingdom. The United States was like that at a time, where you couldn't go through a church community in the Bible Belt in Texas and not talk to somebody who would talk to you about Jesus. But in our distraction, church, we've pursued other idols, and now the prevalence of the witness of the gospel has been diminished because we're busy witnessing about so many other temporal things. And I'm saying to you this morning, we have to return back to the mandate. We have to go back to that. Where does this start, Stephen? It starts in your home. Your kids need to see the gospel of the kingdom demonstrated in front of them. Those kids, your kids, must witness and show this gospel of the kingdom to their friends, you to your coworkers. And then, as God has blessed us, we're to charge people, empower them, equip them to go. To go. It used to be missionaries were something you did if you couldn't do anything else in the ministry. Go to another country and build a church. But we're beyond that age of ignorance. Every missionary we support, I have the interview. I have asked the questions. And first thing I ask is, how long and where did you train? How long and where? And I don't mean just Bible school. I mean train to be a missionary. And every one of our 48 missionaries have lived on the ground, training, developing themselves to make disciples who follow Jesus. The second question I ask is, what happens when you die? I know it's a very encouraging meeting with me when you want support. What happens when you die or you leave the country? Will the gospel go on? Have you raised up pastors, leaders, businessmen, businesswomen? Have you raised up people that if you got sick or you leave or your visa expires, that's going to carry on the work? And if they're not making disciples who make disciples, we just aren't joining with that right now. We're not joining with it. What we're joining with is ministers who know how to make disciples. So if the hostility of the government, politics turns against them, and they have to get out of the country, the work doesn't die, right? Do they make disciples? And the last thing is I ask them to stay connected to us as a church. We need to hear from you. And many times I'll say, when can we come? I've only had one missionary tell me, don't come. We stop supporting. When can we come? When can we see and be a part and send people? My heart is one day, as we grow as a church body, to send missionaries. and send them with a ton of money and a ton of resources into training, developing, then going and planting. That's my heart. And it's not my heart. That's the heart of the Father. Go into all the world, preach the gospel. Our vision as we look to the months ahead, years ahead, is this. I believe we are to equip people in our community with the resources, the finances, so they can solely focus on making disciples. And as they make disciples, those disciples will live this gospel of the kingdom as a witness to the world they're in. And when we've done this enough, and we are joined hands with numerous denominations, numerous churches, numbers that I don't even know in this effort. As you know, we are hand in hand with the Assemblies of God and the missions initiative they have. Their mandate looks like this, and they're going into the darkest, hardest regions. I've been there with many of them in the northern regions, countries above Iran, in southern Turkey, in nations like Georgia and Armenia, Israel, where the gospel is prohibited, and they are making disciples. They're just not standing on a street corner, though it's not a valid way of evangelism. They're just not standing on street corners handing out Bibles. They are building relationship with the lost to bring them to Jesus, to teach them how to follow. We can't do the drive-by shooting approach when it comes to bringing the gospel of the kingdom. We're going to throw a tract out. We're going to hope they read it, right? And maybe something will happen. That's not what Jesus says to do here. Funny story as we close. Man, time's flying. I was in China a number of years ago, maybe around 2004, 2005. A friend of ours had invited us there. And I probably have shared this story before, but we were looking for two people groups there in the Tibetan lands of China. And I don't have time to go into the whole story. Worship team, you can go ahead and come. And as we were there looking for these two people groups, they were very unique in that they were Tibetans, but they had been dominated by the Han Chinese government, and they had secluded themselves into remote regions in the Himalayas and the mountains. So you would literally have a tribe of people secluded or isolated from the rest of the world, and nobody could access them. Now, inside of the village, they had to learn Mandarin, which was the only good thing that Mao did in China, was demand everybody speak Mandarin, because then it made the language barrier disappear for Christians to reach them. They didn't have to learn these unique Tibetan dialects. And so as they're looking for these people groups, and I won't say them because we're live streaming. We're looking for these people groups. My friend Anthony and I were there with our missionary 3 days, going from village to village, asking people, have you seen such and such peoples? We were tourists. I fit in better than my friend Anthony because he's all white and I look somewhat Asian, you know what I'm saying? So we'd go into a city, and as soon as we got to the city, we'd find a place to stay. This moment we found a place to stay, the secret police would show up. They would take our passports. They would say, what are you doing here? They'd question us. They'd give us a hard time, and they'd tell us, get out of here. And they had the right to. I mean, you're in China, you do what they say. They shoot first, and then they ask you questions later. And so we had hopped maybe 2 cities, and we were in the third one, and the sun was coming down, and it was getting dark, and you just don't travel at night in those regions. And perchance we booked ourselves in a hotel there, a little Motel 6 looking place, and sure enough the police came, took our passports, asked us what we're doing. We told them we're just tourists, we told them a story that was true, but it wasn't all the truth. And so after the police left, we went up to our room, and lo and behold, in the room there was a computer. Now this was probably 2004, 2005, so internet was just kind of happening, And so I get online and I find the leader of an organization called the Joshua Project, and by grace of God, somehow his email was on the website. And I emailed him and asked him, because he was the last known American to know where these people group lived. So I emailed him, and of course the time difference between then and here, there and here, was quite a difference, and he happened to get the email and told us exactly where to go and look. Crazy miracle, right? And so the next day, as we're checking in the hotel and stuff, previously that evening, our taxi driver also said he knew where this people group was. And so we're like, well, maybe God brought this taxi driver to us. And so we go, and through our translator, our missionary there, we talk to him. And the next day, the fourth day, we drive for an incredible amount of time up this mountain in northeast China, in Tibet. As we get to the top of the mountain, there's a police car following us the whole way there. I mean, they're not in any way covert. They're following. They want to see what we're doing. So we get there, and one of the agents, or the people that we were talking with, they said, listen, there's usually just one police officer for every village. So about lunchtime, they're pretty methodical to go to lunch, and that's your opportunity to talk to somebody. So we get to the top of the mountain. Sure enough, the police, the secret police, whatever, not so secret police, following us. And he goes on lunch break. We're like, yes. And so we have, in the Tibetan language and in Mandarin, the Jesus video and some literature about Jesus. We walk into the convenience store, just like you would walk into a convenience store, except this is on a mountaintop somewhere in China. And the cashier behind the counter there is a young Amdo Tibetan-looking young lady. And she looks at us and knows a little broken English, but our missionary/translator, Clay Brooks, he says, have you ever heard about Jesus? And she looks at us and grins from ear to ear and said, yes. And I thought, wow. And then she proceeded to say, he lives on the next mountain. So we had to clarify a little bit who Jesus was, because she had never heard about Jesus. There was no crucifixes, no pictures, no TV shows, no tracts, nothing. And we began to share, Clay, our missionary, began to share with her, Jesus came many years ago. He is God. And he came to forgive you of your sins. The things that you do that you know aren't right, and you're hoping God will forgive. And she listened in wonder and somewhat astonishment, like you were telling her about space. She had never heard. They swapped numbers, and over a period of years, our missionaries and connections there would begin to disciple that young lady, and she would become a follower of Jesus. Now, I'm telling you that to say this. There is 3.8 billion people like her who have never heard the name Jesus. 3.8 billion. And this gospel of the kingdom must be preached in all the world as a witness, and then the end will come. And it is a false hope, and I'll make this last point, and I'm running out of time. It is a false belief that we can bring this gospel to the ends of the earth from a place of security. There is a cost. There is a cost. More than your wallet. There's a cost. More Christians are being slaughtered today than any other time in human history, because they really believe this gospel of the kingdom must be preached in all the world as a witness. It's a cost I count every time I put my foot on a plane, many times with one of my sons, and we go to the Middle East, to China, to Asia, to Europe, to South America. There's a cost. We cannot bring the gospel from a place of comfort and think that's our part. It should cost us something to send, to go, to train ourselves to go. And you might be thinking, well, Stephen, I'll never be able to go. I'm just not equipped. You don't know. You don't know. Many of my missionaries started their work when they're 60s. Started in their 60s. And they counted the cost. And they've gone. And this morning, I'm asking you, not only as a pastor, not only as someone who's been in the mission field, but as a follower of Jesus, will you help us keep going? Will you join to help send missionaries around the world, support ministries who are bringing this gospel of the kingdom into dark places? Will you help us? And it might mean cost for you. And I'm not saying trivial things. I'm saying just practical things. It might mean you readjust your budget and say, instead of spending money on these things of entertainment and luxury, I'm going to take a year and put into this thing of supporting a missionary.